Should we be listening to what former Prime Minister Tony Blair has to say on leadership, which is the subject of his latest book? I can almost hear those howls of protest in the comments right now. But I'm an advocate of listening to pretty much everyone. Otherwise, how will you understand what their arguments really are versus the slanted parody that their opponents will inevitably attribute to them? As someone who regularly has an interesting and creative range of views attributed to me by other people, it's something that I would hold to when it comes to other people. Anyway, as regular viewers know, I'm a floating voter here in the UK, which you can take as being an indicator of being at heart something of a centrist. So why wouldn't I be interested, whatever you think of some of his mistakes in office, in what one of the most successful prime ministers in my lifetime, in terms of winning multiple elections, has to say about the exercise of political power? Listening to what people say doesn't require you to agree with them, after all. All right, first of all, it is worth noting the timing of Blair's book on leadership, which has just come out. If Rishi Sunak hadn't stunned and surprised everyone by calling an early election, it would have been appearing early in the run-up to what would have been expected to be a November poll. Almost certainly you would take the timing as being designed to have some influence on the Labour Party movers and shakers as they went into an expected and what turned out to be an actual win and return into government. The book has been described as an instruction manual for leaders. It's not a memoir, he's already done one of those. So it covers things like how to conduct a foreign negotiation, how to manage a bureaucracy, how to handle the media, and so on. Right up to, interestingly, how to manage your inevitable downfall. Bearing in mind that just about all political careers, some point end in defeat. Now, though, we get to compare some of Blair's prescriptions with what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is actually doing in practice, and they don't always match up, although you might say it's only early days. For instance, Blair is relentlessly positive about the prospects for making the world better. It is, he says, a great time to be governing. If the leaders of governments focus on delivery, if they embrace technology, if they seek respect rather than love, then they can make a real difference. You could unkindly contrast that message with Keir Starmer, whose messaging through the election and the early months of power have been gloom, all about how desperate the problems facing the country are, and how desperate the problems facing the world are, and how little can be promised or offered as a result. As you might expect, we could probably all agree with broad generalisations like that. The devil is always in the detail of what they mean in practice. I agree that government should focus on delivery. I get the sense that that is really quite a big ask in the modern bloated government era. Getting well-considered, well-executed action that sticks through the bureaucracy is not exactly something that any governments have been famous for in recent decades, perhaps including the government of Tony Blair himself, although do comment below if you think I'm being unfair. Nevertheless, the idea that leadership should be founded on a vision and a clear direction, that clearly was something that applied. By the time the Blair opposition was elected, you were very clear about their priorities, their programme. For better or worse, those priorities certainly carried through into the first years of actually being in office. Personally, I also agree that effective governments need to embrace technology. But again, that can mean different things to different people. It could mean embracing technocratic government, with the role of experts and algorithms elevated and the population managed to accept what's the best for them rather than actually being involved. Now, I doubt Blair would say that's what he means, but it's certainly one of the things people fear as the consequence of some of his ideas, and he is often dismissed as a technocrat. That notwithstanding, it's clearly crazy that we have huge bloated organisations like the National Health Service working with antiquated technology, big, badly designed systems that don't talk to each other, and so on. It's clear also that modern security and warfare has technology at its heart, and if you're not highly savvy as to how it's going to be used, deployed and defended, you're opening up significant vulnerabilities to your society. So yes, technology is important, but yes, the details matter. What about the leaders seeking respect rather than love? Well, this one I absolutely agree with. It is impossible to make genuinely difficult decisions that a leader of a country must necessarily make, given that so many issues come down to trade-offs between competing interests. If you want to be popular, you will duck those hard questions. And my perception of history is that the outcome is you become unpopular anyway because you are perceived as ineffective. Blair also has advice for his own political movement, the Labour Party, rather echoing, interestingly, that given recently by Barack Obama in his convention speech that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So Blair calls out what he calls the deaf ear culture of many in progressive politics. In other words, people whose conceit is that they represent the working classes, while at the same time being embarrassed by the views of exactly those same people. In that sense, it's a pitch to stay in touch with reality and avoid drifting into ideology, so saying things that shouldn't be contentious, but turn out to be so when you study the excitable trench warfare that is social media. Things like natural gas being essential to the green energy transition, pointing out that the public looks at the Gaza ceasefire demonstrations and is wary of the presence it sees amongst them of Islamist groups. What makes Blair a centrist in the left spectrum of Labour is going to include things like arguing that public services should predominantly be about the users of those services, the parents, the pupils, the patients, rather than the producers of those services, the doctors, the teachers. That is certainly not, arguably, the spirit in which Keir Starmer launched into government. The first action that government took, after all, was to hand out large pay settlements to striking doctors and train drivers, without really negotiating for anything, in fact, in return. One area where I tend to agree with Blair is his critique of populists, obviously in the UK context focused on the likes of Boris Johnson. The feature of populists is that they make big promises that generally just echo what the public wants to hear, suggesting there are simple and easy answers to complex problems. If only you would trust them, then everything will magically be sorted out. Now, one might criticise Keir Starmer for going too far in the opposite direction, being the anti-populist, suggesting that almost nothing can be done. Nevertheless, telling people that you have to balance the public finances, take serious issues seriously, and that doing so costs real money, those should be the grown-up things that we expect from politicians in principle. We might still conclude that their analysis is wrong, that the solutions they offer are not the ones we would prefer, but let's do it on the basis of some expectation of understanding reality, rather than living in a world of alternative facts and wishful thinking. I know, very countercultural, but there it is. Now, when it comes to Blair's assessment of his own performance and that of his government, that's where you would expect there would be probably more variance behind his own perception and other people's. He doesn't do the big thing, suggesting that going to war with Iraq was a mistake, which is what many people would say that he should be saying. He does say that for both Iraq and Afghanistan, he was hubristic about the likelihood of successfully bringing about the conditions where democracy would stick. Kind of hard to argue with that one. He also turned on one of the labels his government put forward thanks to the Foreign Minister Robin Cook. Its stated commitment to operating a, quote, ethical foreign policy. As opposed to the horrid shades of grey pragmatism that every other government operates by and has operated by. Promising an ethical foreign policy, he said, was the foolish promise made by a naive opposition. These are relatively easy things to admit in outline. Of course, the real-life blood and guts consequences are rather more stark than he's perhaps willing to go into here. Blair argues that leadership effectiveness comes with experience, which sounds obvious. Although, do the facts bear it out? He reckons he has learned so much since he was PM, he would be a lot better in number 10 now. And he reckons as well that his second full term in charge was a lot better than his first full term in charge because he'd already learned so much by then. But like I said, history doesn't really seem to go that way. In my lifetime, only 2 prime ministers, him and Margaret Thatcher, lasted over 10 years. So the others didn't seem to get better fast enough. Both of those 2 administrations were by then notably battered and exhausted, weighed down with the baggage of multiple mistakes, and after the 10-year mark, they were quickly deposed soon afterwards. Discussing this point in his review of Blair's new book in the Financial Times, the former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, made this argument, quote, "Democracies need change, fresh blood, and the anything is possible enthusiasm that comes with inexperience have a place too. There's a reason," he says, "why Americans decided presidents shouldn't serve more than 2 terms. I tend to think that's right. I've seen it as well in the context of other organisations, particularly big businesses. Leaders in those situations, as indeed prime ministers, are surrounded by people who filter what the leader sees, what they read, where they go, all in the name of using the leader's time the most effectively. But in practice, it means they become gradually over time, unless they work really hard to counter it, more and more removed from understanding how the world actually works, which obviously doesn't help you to make good quality decisions." Why does any of this matter? Why is it interesting? Because it's always worth those of us who spend all our time doing the easy thing, commenting and criticising what others are doing, to acknowledge the fact that the hardest thing is actually being in there, being the person trying to get the stuff done. I'm sure Blair would be happy for his book to get a wide audience, but it reads like it was written specifically for those running, or aspiring to run, countries. I think for those who live well outside the frame of what it takes to actually do that thing, it's quite an interesting insight into how it works as well as how it can go wrong. Anyway, there it is. Now you've heard the very broadest headlines of what Tony Blair thinks. Your turn. What do you value in good political leaders? Do you want them to tell you the hard truths, or simply to promise to solve the problems and not bother you with the details? Or what third, fourth, fifth options? Let me know in the comments below.